Good evening and welcome. Here tonight, we're here to talk about the FY23 proposed budget. But before we get started on officially kicking off the budget committee with the election of a new chair, I wanted to start again this year with the training. It's going to be similar to last year. Just going over the process over the coming 3 evenings, Oregon budget law, and the role of the budget committee. Because everybody is returning from last year, and I did this training last year, I actually cut out the portion that was on city finances. That's something I'll do again in the future. I kind of foresee doing that every few years, or if we have some turnover in members. But just to move through this quickly this evening so we can get into the fun part of the committee, I'm going to just cover the basics. All right, use of technology. For the public comment process, we ask that members of the public keep their microphone muted until agenda item business from the audience. If you're joining us online with a tablet, smartphone, or computer and wish to speak during business from the audience, please use the raise the hand option to be called upon to provide comment when the designated time is announced. If you just scroll to the bottom of your screen, you'll see reactions, and there's a raise your hand function there. Public comment should be a comment submitted by email and mail will also be read into the record if time allows. And then this evening, we're also providing a space for in-person comment. If someone chooses to show up, we'll set up a space in JMR. When we get to that point in the evening where we take business from the audience, we'll start with any in-person comments before we move on to individuals that raise their hand. And just backing up too, I also want to say with this training, I'm going to same way with my presentation later is I want to treat this like a conversation. If you have any questions, raise your hand and we can just talk through them as we go through this presentation. And then for the business from the audience, we've set aside 20 minutes at the end of this evening. Technology tips for the committee. Please keep your microphone on mute unless you would like to speak. To indicate to the chair your desire to speak, please use the raise your hand function. That'll actually be effective once we kick off the committee for this training. I'll be that person to call on individuals. The chat should be disabled, but remember that all chat becomes part of the public record. And then all the meetings of the budget committee will be recorded. Voting mechanics, similar to last year. We're going to do a voice vote. All in favor, aye. All opposed, no, when deciding on motions. In the case of any no votes, the chair will need to ask for a roll call vote in order to identify the vote count and vote ownership for the record. Voting mechanics for electing officers. If there's multiple nominees, roll call vote and ask that each voting member indicate the name of the nominee they wish to cast a vote in favor of. If there's just a single nominee, we'll use the process of the aye or no that I described above. And then one last item of note, the department directors are going to be available all 3 evenings, including tonight. We have 30 minutes set aside for questions from department directors if we have time this evening. We did the pre-recorded presentations again this year, so hopefully that's going to provide us a lot more time for the questions and answers, as well as just conversation among the budget committee. Our agendas for the evenings, starting with this evening, the budget orientation that I'm doing now. After we complete this, we'll officially kick off the budget committee, which is the welcome from the chair. Last year's chair was Luke Lumberg. He will start the meeting off. He'll ask staff for a roll call, and then we'll do election of the officers. Once a new chair is elected, we immediately pass the gavel, and that individual will run the meeting from that point forward. From there, we have the delivery of the budget message by City Manager Nancy Newton, a budget overview by myself, and then we'll take a 10-minute intermission. And then after that, we'll have some time for questions and discussion on the budget, the 30 minutes that I mentioned, where we can start asking questions of directors. Business from the audience, scheduled for 20 minutes. And that'll conclude evening one. Next week, Tuesday, May 3rd. Again, we'll start off with just the welcome from the chair and roll call from staff. And this is where we have a considerable amount of time set aside for questions and discussions. 2 hours with a 10-minute intermission in between. This to me will be the evening where we really kind of just the meat of the budget. After that, we've got business from the audience scheduled for 20 minutes, and then that'll conclude evening 2. And then the final evening, Tuesday, May 10th, we're going to start off with the budget process for the Springfield Economic Development Corporation. And this is just essentially a scaled down version of the process that I'm describing over these 3 evenings for the city. We're anticipating 45 minutes for that process. So we expect the city budget committee then to kick back off at around 6:15. We'll take a short intermission between CETA and the city. For CETA, we have 2 additional, I'm sorry, actually, I think we have 3 additional members, 4. The mayor is here as a guest for the city, but is part of the process for CETA. So 4 additional members. We'll have 2 more citizen appointees, the mayor and the county commissioner, Joe Burney. At 6:15 roughly, we'll kick off the city budget process again with the welcome from the chair and a roll call from staff. Then we'll have a public hearing on state shared revenue. We've set aside another 30 minutes for questions and discussion. Then we'll have a brief intermission. And then for the 3rd evening, we've set aside a little more time for business from the audience, 30 minutes. And then we move into the process of the city budget deliberations and approvals. That's where I'm going to bring up a spreadsheet, and we're going to start with the budget as proposed, and then entertain motions for any proposed adjustments. And then at the end of the evening, there will be a series of motions at the end of your packet that will need to be made to essentially conclude the process. We've set aside a 4th evening if needed. We don't anticipate that. I don't think it's a meeting that we've needed in a number of years, but we have reserved that 4th meeting, May 17th, if necessary. On to Oregon budget law. Local budget law does 3 important things. It establishes standard procedures for preparing, presenting, and administering the budget. It requires citizen involvement in the preparation of the budget and public disclosures of the budget before its formal adoption. And it controls expenditure of public funds. And I'm going to touch on all 3 of these here, starting with standard procedures for preparing. Essentially, I've distilled it down to 7 steps. The first one is a proposed budget is prepared. This kicks off usually sometime in October. We'll bring a 5-year forecast to council in a work session and discuss some of the issues that we'll be dealing with as we put together that coming year's budget. We start meeting as a budget team on a regular basis. We open up our budgeting software to departments for data entry, and then meet with all the departments and discuss their budgets. And this culminates with a balanced budget coming to you starting this evening. Essentially, it's about 6 months of work that goes into it and a lot of staff time to get us to this point. The budget committee meets. We're going to meet 3 evenings. The budget committee approves and recommends a budget. And one of the things I want to just highlight is recommends. I'm going to touch on that a little later. A budget summary and notice of budget hearing is published, and then a budget hearing is held. That budget hearing is scheduled for a regular session, council session on June 20th. The budget is adopted, appropriations made, and a tax levy declared. And then the last step is we file with the county and our levy is certified. The second item from those 3 important things is the public process. Essentially, to give the public ample opportunity to participate in budgeting process. Local budget law requires that a budget committee be formed and a public process conducted to approve the budget. What is a budget committee? The budget committee is the city's fiscal planning advisory committee. The committee consists of the city councilors and an equal number of citizens at large. Citizen members are appointed by the city council. They serve 3-year terms. Terms are staggered to turn over by 1/3 each year. And you can serve 2 consecutive terms before being required to sit out a year. The budget committee's main role. Meets publicly to deliberate on the proposed budget, provides an opportunity for the general public to comment on the proposed budget, may make adjustments to the proposed budget, approves and recommends a balanced budget to the city council for adoption. And it's a recommending body. It is not a decision-making body. When that budget goes forward to council, which will be on June 20th, council can still make changes to that budget. So it's just one of those things I wanted to stress. Is that it is a recommending body. Recommends tax levies and debt service amounts, holds a public hearing and makes recommendations to the city council on the use of state revenue sharing monies, and communicates with members of the community about the budget process, opportunity to provide input and constraints the city faces in financing all requested services. So you're essentially just ambassadors to the city's budget, a resource for our larger community. What the budget committee is not authorized to do, you cannot change salaries, you cannot negotiate contracts, you cannot change council priorities or policies, and you cannot change the law. The rules regarding budget committee meetings. They're open to the public. A quorum is required to approve any motion, one more than half the total number of members. And on that, I want to stress is total number of members. It's not based on the members present. So well, for instance, tonight, Councilor Rodley isn't here at this time. Our quorum would still be 7 as opposed to 6. And so for any decisions that get made, we will need 7 positive votes to move those forward. If no quorum exists, you may discuss committee business, but no formal action can be taken. It requires the election of a chair, a vice chair, and we'll also elect a secretary. A secretary is a requirement for intergovernmental agencies. As part of our process, we also adopt the MWMC budget, and so they require a secretary. Just for convenience and ease, when we do our elections, we're going to just elect a secretary and they'll serve for both organizations. The positions serve 1 year, and a chair is expected to maintain an aura of impartiality, to run the meeting in a fair, equitable, and civil manner, ensuring members of the public are provided an open forum to speak about the budget. The minutes of each meeting must be kept. The approval of the final budget document, tax levies and debt service amounts should be in the form of a motion with the votes recorded in the minutes. And discussions of the budget committee must always take place in the form of a public meeting. And I'm going to discourage you from reaching out to each other outside of the committee meeting to discuss the proposed budget. Just a couple other things I'd like to touch on. Oregon budget law requires a budget committee. It requires the budget be developed and balanced by fund. It requires legal appropriations on some level. And this gets to the third point in terms of controlling expenditures. The 3 things that local budget law does. Our legal level is by fund, department, and category. And the categories, and this kind of goes back to the financial portion of the training that I've done previously. For us, operating is our 500, 600, 700,000 accounts. Capital is its own legal level, and then non-departmental, there's a number of categories within that. But again, just stressing, legal level is by fund, department, and category. Let's see, it requires the fiscal year be July 1st to June 30th. This is a question folks ask all the time. Why does your fiscal year start on July 1st? Because it's required by the state. It encourages public involvement by public hearings, and it serves to control spending by limiting changes the city council can make. If you want any additional info on Oregon budget law, I encourage you to go to the Department of Revenue website. The address is there. and the law is found in Oregon revised statutes beginning at ORS 294.305. And finally, I've talked about all these requirements, and then it begs the question is who follows up to ensure that those requirements are being met? The final phase in the budgeting cycle is the audit of the previous fiscal year. Most local governments are subject to Oregon budget law and are required to have their accounts and fiscal affairs audited and examined annually. An audit must be done by an auditor certified by the Oregon State Board of Accountancy to conduct municipal audits. In addition to the financial audit of how local governments handle public funds, the auditor will also look at compliance with state laws and regulations. Our audit firm is Grove Mueller Swank, and I'm going to bring up another document here. We'll stop share for a second. Okay, can everyone see that? All right, I'm going to assume yes. I didn't hear anything. Last year I was talking and you were still looking at my slide and not at this document. So this is from our fiscal year 21 ACFR, our annual comprehensive financial report. That is the last one that was completed. And at the back of this report, in the compliance section, there will be a letter from our auditors, independent auditors report required by Oregon state regulations. Make that a little bigger so it's easier for me. And going to that second paragraph, compliance and other matters, as part of obtaining reasonable assurance about whether the city's financial statements are free of material misstatement, we perform tests of its compliance with certain provisions of laws, regulations, contracts, blah, 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 and the provisions of Oregon revised statutes as specified. So what they've done is, if you look at those bulleted bold items there, the third item is budget legally required. So in addition to that, they're doing those other items as well. And then the important paragraph is that last paragraph on this page. In connection with our testing, nothing came to our attention that caused us to believe that the city was not in substantial compliance with certain provisions of laws, regulations, and contracts. The same paragraph that I read earlier. So this would relate to the budget committee process that we completed last year. And again, I encourage you to close the loop after this budget process when this report is published, usually in January of the following year. 2023 is when the fiscal year 22 report will be put out there. Let's stop the share again. Back to the presentation. And that concludes the training presentation. If you cannot make it in the evenings, please reach out to myself or Neil Obringer and let us know. Our contact information is there, and as well as if you have any questions at any point over the coming weeks, feel free to reach out to us as well. Any questions?
Just really quickly, Nathan, I think you switched screens. Your email is up instead of the agenda for the meeting. I just wanted to point that out.
Well, thank you. How did I do that? Is that sharing the right screen? Okay, thank you. So Holly, were you going to point that out to me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? No questions. We can get started with kicking off the FY23 budget committee.
All right, that means me.
That means you.
Excellent. Welcome, everyone. I'll ask now that the staff conduct a roll call.
Counselor Pitts,
Here.
Counselor Moe,
Here.
Counselor Rodley, Counselor Stair, Counselor Woodrow,
Here.
Counselor Pictionary,
I'm here, thank you.
Luke Lundberg,
Here.
George Jesse,
Here.
Darlene Reich,
Here.
Stephen Schmunk,
Here.
Holly Schaefer,
Here.
and Paul Shelby.
Here.
Okay, thank you. Just to reiterate, as we begin our meeting tonight, I would like to ask that members of the audience who are joining us online, please keep yourself on mute until you're called to provide public testimony. There's one time in the evening designated for public testimony. You will be listed as business from the audience on the agenda. If you are attending in person, please complete the request to speak card located at the entrance of the Jesse main room and give to the budget officer. If you're joining us online with a tablet, smartphone, or computer and wish to speak during that time, please use the raise hand option to be called upon to provide your comment. The order of public testimony is as follows. Anyone who's in person, anyone who's raised their virtual hand, anyone who submitted email in advance, and then finally, anyone who submitted written comments via mail in advance. All right. So just to verify very quickly, Nathan, do we need seconds for the nominations?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to ask for nominations for a position of chair.
I nominate Holly.
Okay, second.
I second.
Okay. Any other nominations? Oh,
I had my hand raised.
sorry, yeah,
I was going to nominate Darlene Raish.
okay. Second,
I second.
all right. So we'll go with, we'll start, we're gonna do a voice vote. Each person will signal who they want to vote for by naming that individual, all right?
Counselor Pitts,
Hi.
Counselor Moe,
Holly.
Counselor Woodrow,
Darlene.
Counselor Pictionary,
Darlene, and I was confused with Counselor Pitt's vote. Did he say I or Darlene?
Said I.
I said neither, I said Holly.
and just want to confirm that we haven't had Counselors Rodley or Stair join us.
I, sorry about that. I just wanted to weigh in if I could. I vote Holly.
Luke Lundberg,
Darlene,
George Jesse,
Holly Schaefer.
Darlene Reich,
Well, since I nominated her, I'm going to vote for her, Holly.
Stephen Schmunk,
Darlene.
Holly Schaefer,
Oh gosh, I guess I'll vote for myself.
and Paul Selby.
Holly Schaefer.
So Chair, I show that we have 7 votes in favor of Holly and 4 for Darlene. So the vote for Holly is passed.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's time to call for nominations for vice chair.
I've got my hand up.
Sorry, Joe.
It's
Counselor
okay.
Pictionary.
I'd like to nominate Steve Schmuck.
I second.
Are there any other nominations? All right. With this, do we do just a voice vote then?
We can do all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right. Sorry, was somebody saying something? All right. And then,
So maybe state for the record that the vote was unanimous and that Steve Schwank becomes vice chair.
thank you. So that vote was unanimous and Stephen Schmunk becomes vice chair. And then I was going to ask, it says an election of secretary as well. All right, calling for nominations for the position of secretary.
I'll nominate Darlene.
Sorry.
Second.
Are there any other nominations for secretary? All right, calling for a voice vote for election of Darlene Raish as the secretary. All
Yes.
in favor, say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All opposed, any opposed? Sorry. All right, Darlene Raish has been elected secretary by unanimous voice vote. And I believe that concludes all of the elections for this budget committee. And so I believe now we would move to staff opening remarks with Nancy.
Thank you, Chair Shaper. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first budget committee for fiscal year 2023. I just want to thank the committee members for volunteering for this important role for the city. I know it is a lot of work on top of your already busy schedule. So tonight, my opening comments are going to be a little different than last year because I want to update everyone on what's been happening since we last met. So you may recall last year, we had recently received notification that the city would be receiving federal funding through the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. Specifically, we received that notification in March and then received a subsequent allocation of funds in May. Although this was great news and that we would be getting this funding, we still needed time to develop a policy framework for decision-making and a list of projects for the City Council to consider. We wanted to address this funding over a number of meetings to give the council time to deliberate and to make decisions around competing projects. So that's, sort of a time frame of how that came in proximity to these deliberations. It's also important to note that ARPA funds are one-time funding, and so it's a government finance best practice to use one-time funds for one-time or limited duration purposes. In 2021, the Government Finance Officers Association released recommended guiding principles for the use of ARPA funds. So we reviewed these principles with council on September 13. So I'm not going to go over them tonight, but we did use them as a prism for guiding our recommendations to council for the use of this funding. So generally speaking, we prioritize projects that fit one or more of the following criteria: that they were one-time or limited in nature, they provided a significant and visible community benefit, they helped address the general fund's financial structural imbalance. So you may have noticed in my budget message, I listed what has been approved to date for ARPA funding by council through the supplemental budget process. Because we only have through fiscal year 2024 to obligate the funds, we thought it was important to get council's input on the projects. As a result, you'll see some of these projects funded in fiscal year 22. Others are going to be proposed in this budget process. You'll also notice some ARPA funds used for staffing. Ordinarily, I wouldn't use short-term funding for personnel, but I made some exceptions for some of the positions proposed in this year's budget for the following reasons: that either the position is urgently needed, the position is in the community interest or the position is limited in duration and will not be made permanent. And I think that's kind of an important distinction. Numerous times I've brought this up to council and before this committee about how really thin the staffing level is in Springfield, and it is a serious matter. Because our staffing is so low, we weren't at capacity to take on ARPA projects. So we also have some unfunded mandates from the state that are set to kick in next year. So we use some of the ARPA funds to help defray those costs, and Nathan Bell will go into this in more detail in his presentation. But for the most part, we used ARPA funds to address our critical building infrastructure needs that have been deferred for many years. Capital projects are a great way to use short-term funding, as we know that construction costs escalate over time, and investing ARPA money now will save us from using other fund sources in the future. So it was really a priority and to look at some of these facilities needs, knowing, hey, if we can knock some of these off currently, that will only be to the good in future years. I listed also a number of issues in my budget message that the city is facing today and in the future. They're challenging, but they're not insurmountable. One significant issue that we will be dealing with shortly is the continuation of our police department funding. So in order to maintain our current level of police services and jail operations, we will need to renew the public safety levy of $1.40 per $1,000 of assessed property value in the next general election this November. So that is just we will be going to council for this authorization. It will be a straight renewal, no increase. And I've asked Nathan to give some context of why this is important. And he has some slides on police funding in his presentation. I like to include some positive news. So I'm going to keep my remarks brief and try to share some positive news. So I think we all can agree, the last couple of years actually have been pretty challenging time for all of us, and there's been a lot of uncertainty, but the impact of the city was not catastrophic. In fact, 2020 and 2021 were banner years for residential permits, and we did not see a really significant contraction in construction. So I would put this in the good news column because the construction industry is an early economic indicator. So even with rising inflation in the cost of goods and services, we had a really busy year at the development center. So I want to acknowledge their work and really pushing that out. Our transient room tax is recovering well. And although we are not yet on the same level as we were prior to the pandemic, this indicator is also a positive one. I just also want to highlight the important asset to the city of our mayor and council, and they have given a lot of their time to review thousands of pages of documents and make decisions about really complex issues. We've really moved the ball on a lot of big projects in the past year. So thank you to the mayor and council. Our city staff, they always continue to impress me with their dedication and professionalism. They're just so creative. They're hardworking, super committed to doing good work for the committee, and they also deserve our thanks and respect. And finally, I want to thank you, our budget committee, for your service to your community and for all the thoughtful deliberations that I know you will do over the next few weeks, and the time that you will take reading materials, the time you spent reviewing videos, and really weighing all the issues that are coming before you. And it's really going to be a pleasure to work with all of you. So this concludes my remarks for this evening. Chair Shaper, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I'm going to ask everyone to bear with me as I clearly don't know what I'm doing. So please offer corrective guidance, as I know many of you have more experience at this, and it would be welcomed. Right now, it looks like we're going for introduction of the budget from Nathan Bell.
Doing great, Chair Shaper. I'm going to share my screen again. Hopefully not my email. All right, everyone can see that? Welcome again. For anyone who might be joining us, I'm Nathan Bell. I'm the city's finance director. The slide deck that I have this evening is going to be very familiar to you. I feel like it's a good slide deck in terms of providing the context for the environment that we were working in as we put this budget together, and for the conversation that we're going to have over the coming 3 evenings. As I mentioned earlier, I want this to be a conversation, rather than wait till the end. I've got a lot of slides to cover here. We're going to cover a lot of ground. I think it's good ground, but if you've got a question, ask it, and we can talk as we go through it. The schedule, I covered this in the training, so I'm actually not going to cover it again here. I'm going to go right into measure 5 and 50. I think it's hard to have a conversation on budget in the state of Oregon without talking about measures 5 and 50. Measures 5 and 50 were voter-led initiatives back in the 90s, early 90s for measure 5. Put a limit on property taxes expended on general government at $10 per thousand. It's based on real market value, and $5 per thousand for education. Measure 50 did a number of things, but I think the primary one as it relates to our conversation this evening is it put a collar on assessed valuation growth, essentially then separating, and now we have assessed value and real market value. And so the assessed value cannot increase by more than 3% a year. And what that's done over the coming decades is it's created an environment where our revenue growth has not kept pace with our growth in expenditures. And this next slide, I think, is really going to illustrate that well. And actually, I'm going to go to that before I continue. I think one of the big things I just want to stress here is that, and I've kind of, it's something I've thought about, but I haven't said out loud. I'm going to say it out loud. Our funding of local government in the state of Oregon is broken. Our property taxes essentially fund our city government, our county government, and our education system. Just out of curiosity, I did some Googling the other day, just looking at the tax burden by state. And for the state of Oregon, the tax burden has us at about 25 out of 50 states, square in the middle. And when I see that, my thought is that's not a bad place to be, middle of the pack for the tax burden. But then when you look at the tax burden of specifically income taxes, we're number 2 out of 50 states for the highest burden. And what that basically means is while our overall tax burden for the citizens may be reasonable, we're skewed to the income tax, which funds our state government. And the result is, as local governments, we're struggling to fund the services that our citizens count on. And so, and this is illustrated well just in the area of public safety. This is our public safety operating expenses and revenues. This includes, in addition to the general fund, both of our levy funds, the fire levy fund and the police levy fund. There's a lot going on here. I'll try to break it down for you. In the bar columns, we have our expenditures, and that's broken out into the shaded solid, light shaded solid is our police levy. The solid dark shaded section, the small section, is our fire levy. And then the sort of dotted larger sections is our general fund funding through property taxes. If we look at the dashed line, green line, you can see that just is very consistent in its growth, and that is that 3% collar. But if you look at those bars above it, the growth in public safety, while our revenues have grown by roughly 3% per year, some years a little more just with growth in the community, our public safety expenditures on average have grown by roughly 5% year over year. And how we've addressed that is through levies. If we go back to 2003, when the first ones were put on the ballot, both a police and a fire levy, to essentially get to the level of service that our community desired. In 2010, you see a jump in the police levy. That was the addition of our jail. But as you can see, our funding, even with the levies, has not kept pace with the growth and the cost of public safety. And again, this just points straight back to Measure 5 and Measure 50, and really how it's hobbled our main funding source. Another thing I want to point out too is looking at the fire levy. It most recently went on the ballot in November of 2020. It passed a 5-year levy that began on July 1st, 2021. That funds a portion of a 5th fire station. We increased it from 36 cents to 38 cents per thousand just to maintain status quo. That increase just covered the commitment we had already made with that levy. And that commitment for that fire station is roughly between 65 and 70% of the total cost of running that station. So when we first passed that levy in 2003, it covered 100% of funding that 5th station. It now covers roughly 65 to 70%. So I'm going to show you a number of charts for different funds, starting with the general fund. This is actually a good looking chart. And part of the reason is we put a lot of energy into our general fund. And as you look down the shaded gray area, that's our reserve balance. It's relatively consistent. That spike in 21 of revenue is the result of $700,000 in CARES dollars that we received into the general fund to cover staffing for our response to the COVID pandemic. That staffing wasn't new staffing, it was already budgeted for. So that 700,000 was essentially a windfall in that year. And so you see a little spike in our revenue and in our reserve. In 22, and as Nancy had mentioned, the impacts of the pandemic didn't materialize as we anticipated. But there were some impacts, and we'll see that in some of these funds as we get here later in the presentation. So we saw a little bit of an impact from 21 to 22 showing up in our general fund, but you can see that the general fund is on course to really kind of recover and kind of keep that gradual steady increase that we can depend on in that fund. I think the more important chart that I want to show you is our 5-year forecast, and you've seen a lot of 5-year forecasts. I was looking at the forecast that I presented last year, and interesting enough, I opened it up by saying that it was one of the more positive forecasts that I had put in front of you in a while. And there were a number of reasons behind that. We had done 2 rounds of cuts at that point, trying to get towards sustainability in our general fund. We had built in an anticipated increase in our pilot. That's our payment in lieu of tax. It's an intergovernmental agreement we have with the Springfield Utility Board. I can happily say that we actually completed negotiations and implemented that new IGA on January 1st of this past year, and that's going to bring an additional $900,000 roughly into our general fund. This also, that previous forecast included increases to our assessed valuation relating to development within the community, specifically Marcola Metals. And then it included a enterprise zone exemption expiration for international paper. So there were a lot of positive forces that produced a better forecast last year. Unfortunately, the forecast I'm putting in front of you this evening isn't as positive. Looking at fiscal year 23, the budget that we're considering here in this process, we're looking at a deficit spend of $600,000. That's not a bad place to be. And if we look down to the bottom, the ending cash as a percent of operating expenditures is 24%. We've always said our target is never lower than 20%. So we're well above that. And we've been able to accomplish this with ARPA dollars to preserve our ending reserve balance. And in looking at that deficit spend, 300,000 of that is related to a transfer to our ambulance fund. So that partially justifies, and I'm going to talk about the ambulance fund later and why a subsidy isn't necessarily a bad thing for that fund. PERS increases happen on even years at the biennial. So the next increase we'll see is in 24. And that's why we see that jump from a $600,000 deficit spend to a $1.5 million, $1.6 million deficit spend. I've got a PERS slide. I'll be talking about that here in a little bit as well. It has our ending reserve at 19%. That's dipping into that negative territory, but it's not a bad place to be a year out. There's still a lot we can do about that. And as part of that 1.6 million, 500,000, just over 500,000 is a transfer in support of the anticipated transfer in support of the ambulance fund. It's when we get up to fiscal year 25 that things really kind of take a dive. And the reason for that is the ARPA funds have to be expended, or I should say obligated, by December 30th of 2024. That's halfway into fiscal year 25. After that date, those positions that we are funding with ARPA funds for the ongoing positions are going to come back into the general fund. And that's where our forecast takes that turn for the worse, dropping down to 13% in 25, 4% in 26. We have another PERS increase in 26, and then into negative territory in 27. So that's the challenge that we have in front of us. And also, partly what's contributing to this change as well, as I mentioned, all those positive things that had happened and last year coming into that forecast. This year, there are two kind of on the opposite side of things, negative things that have happened to us. One is our insurance experience. Our insurance deductibles have increased and they've become per occurrence. And then we also have the paid family medical leave that came down through the state, which will be implemented on January 1st, 2023. The insurance cost doesn't always materialize immediately. A lot of times with lawsuits, they can take years to get to that point of settlement. But we hired an actuary to come in and they looked at our past experience, applied it to our new insurance model, and they said, okay, here's what you would need to save on an annual basis to cover any potential claims. And so we're setting aside, based on that study, in the general fund alone, $420,000 a year. That being said, that doesn't have to, Councilor Stare.
Hey, Nate, I was actually putting my hand up to just ask a question at the end. Thanks. Hey,
Okay. The end
by
is
the way,
far
I
ways
apologize
away
everyone
right
for
now.
the-
So
Okay,
you can remember that question?
I'll remember it. Yep,
Okay.
thanks.
So we've made changes that led to that insurance experience. And so the past doesn't have to be an indicator of the future. And we've made some positive changes, and I don't anticipate that we will experience what the information the actuaries based their estimates on. But all the same, we have to act as though we might, and we have to start setting these dollars aside, and it is impacting our general fund. And then for the paid Family Medical Leave Act, it's 1% of personal services, and for the general fund annually, we're looking at about $220,000. So between those two, we're looking at almost $650,000 a year in the general fund. That's over $3 million over 5 years, and you can see why then we start getting into that negative territory. As far as the Paid Family Medical Leave Act and some other things coming down from the state, that's something I'm going to talk about a little later in my presentation. George Jesse.
Just a quick comment on some of the things you just put out about state mandates in particular. They oftentimes are unfunded. And I think it would be incumbent on the city and other local governments to make sure the public knows what effect those have on the local governments. I don't want to get into the political debate on what's appropriate and what's not necessarily at this time, but at least that information, maybe the city or the city council should take some positions on that, saying we may support this as a social idea, but the financial impacts to each local government are going to be X number of dollars. And that might have some influence on these unfunded mandates that come down from the state.
All right, thank you, George. Counselor Stair, are you going to leave your hand up, or did you want to ask your question now?
Actually, that was very similar to the question that I was going to ask. Mr. Jesse took care of it for me. Thank you.
Excellent. And I'm gonna touch on that a little bit later. It partially ties back to when I talked about the income tax burden that we have in this state. You know, there are these unfunded mandates, but the funding is up there. It's not down here. And that's something we need to work on. And when we get to our solutions in a later slide, you know, addressing legislative activities is going to be one of those solutions. So it's good input. Hers. So this is another slide looking at last year's. It took a turn for the worse. And we don't have a lot of control over this. And PERS, just on a regular basis, revises their projections, and their most latest revision has a higher PERS cost in these outer years. And to be prudent, we have to take it at face value and work it into our forecast. But it's another one of those kind of negative influences on that 5-year forecast that I shared earlier. FTE. And before I start on the slide, I'm going to quickly point out, as my peers pointed out to me here earlier today, on the vertical axis, I'm starting at 200 FTE, and we're only going up to 225. I know that skews things, and if I started at 0, it would look a lot different. But I'm doing this because for a number of reasons. These are general fund FTE, majority of them are police and fire. When we make cuts, we typically don't make them to police and fire. We make them a lot of times to the supporting departments. And sometimes these departments are small, like HR. When you have 6 people and you cut 1 person, that's a big cut. And so we are such a lean organization. Every FTE matters. It really does. And that's why I like this graph still. Just recognize that I have, you know, the vertical axis is having some impact on how it presents. Going back, this is roughly what, 13 years. Starting in FY10, you see in FY11, we start making cuts. This was the result of the recession that began in 08. Recessions find their way late into government, but they also leave government a little later. We kind of bottomed out in FY14, and we started to build back some FTE. Based on some 5-year forecasts in 20 and 21, we went through 2 rounds of reductions that I talked about, starting to cut back down. And then you see this spike going up in FY23. That represents 10 positions. Now, those 10 positions aren't in the general fund. I'm showing them on this graph, but they aren't in the general fund right now. They're in our special revenue fund being funded by ARPA funds. They have the potential, some of them, to come back into the general fund after December 30th of 2024. And that'll be a decision that is considered at a later date. But more important, rather than look at it from this perspective, the next slide shows that FTE per capita, because over those 13 years, the city has grown. And when the city grows, so does its demand for services, the service level. And so when you look at that dip, the cut from the recession, we never really recovered on a per capita basis. When we made those reductions in FY21 and 22, we cut deep and we felt it. And that's partially the reason that we're adding staffing back. And the staffing we've added back, if we look at it per capita, is only getting us back to that recession level of staffing. And so the pressures that we're feeling as staff are still significant. The other thing I think I want to touch on this slide is that when you go back to those earlier years in the recession, we have no problem filling positions. However, we're not in a recession right now, and it's an employees market. And from a conversation with the HR director earlier, I think we're just under 40 vacant positions right now that we're trying to fill. There are positions that we have gone out 2 and 3 times and we can't fill. And some of these are key positions. This graph, these are budgeted positions. They're not filled positions. So our budgeted level gets us up to that pre-recession level. But if you can imagine we're 40 positions short, that's across the entire organization. You know, we're struggling staffing wise. And in addition to that, We've got the ARPA funds to spend within a time frame, not just our direct allocation, but funds that are coming down through the state, as well as some unfunded mandates. And I'll touch on those unfunded mandates a little later. Councilor Stair, do you have another question?
Yes, I do have a question this time, Nick. I wanted to ask the increases in the full-time staffing. Are those fairly proportional across the departments of the city staff? Or are there particular departments that were short that we're trying to replenish?
We've invested, it's not proportionate. We've invested in key areas, and I'm actually going to cover every single one of those positions in this presentation.
Very good. Thank you.
Councilor Pictionary.
Thanks, Nate. Those positions that are funded and not filled, is that reflected in your 5-year forecast in regards to operating expenditures and personnel services? Are those factored into those costs?
Yeah, great question. We create, we add to our forecast an underspend because we have to spend, we set a legal level and we can't spend above it. And we set it in such a way that we typically spend below. So we always have underspend. That underspend historically has ranged around $1 million, but with the reductions we made in 21-22, we reduced our underspend to around 600,000, knowing as we cut positions, departments were going to leave less money on the table. Recognizing that we have these vacancies right now, we increased our underspend to $1 million a year over those 5 years, partly to offset that. And then additionally, with some of those positions that we can't fill, we may revisit and have to, upgrade them in terms of making them more attractive to bring individuals in these positions. So we're going to have to get creative in other ways. We really can't continue on with this number of positions unfilled. So yes, it's partially reflected through increasing the underspend. Probably doesn't fully capture it, but it is not our plan to stay in this state for long if we have any way to help it. Councilor Pitts and Chair Shaper, I hope you don't mind me just calling people during the presentation. It seems more efficient.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, as far as these unfilled positions, has there been any, like, speaking to different, community groups or even, diversity committees to see what are some of the things culturally that are keeping people from wanting to apply? I mean, nothing against Springfield as a city, but, if these positions are filled and people aren't rushing to apply to these, how can we use some of that money to create a city that people would want to live and work, and have those things been considered from a cultural perspective?
So this seems like it's something everyone's interested in right now. So if it's all right, I'd like to bring up the HR director, Shane Hertz, maybe to respond to that question. I think he might be in a better place to answer that.
And I would also just really quickly, Nathan, if you don't mind, as Chaim comes up, I would just want to mention, address Councilor Pitt's question about outreach to different groups. I participate, and myself, Chaim, and Neil Ladati participate with SAFER. We have a regularly scheduled meeting with them, and we talk to them about openings in the city. We also have a really extensive mailing list that announcements go to, but point well taken. I think that this is a national trend with recruitment. I was just talking to a couple of people that I know that work in this field of recruitment, just saying that a national trend that numbers are down for people applying for positions. I just think one person opined that it was her experience, and she's been in the field for over 20 years, that maybe right now people are reluctant to leave their current job. After you're in a time of uncertainty, sometimes you're less likely to leave. So there's a host of reasons why, some people, those numbers are down nationally, but I think Shane can speak to that as well.
So good evening. I didn't quite catch the full scope of the question. I thought Nancy did a good job of answering it. Was the question just generally speaking around recruitment numbers being down, or was it broader than that, Councilor Pitts? I'm sorry.
It's definitely much broader. I mean, at U of O, it's the exact same thing, but also one of the issues at University of Oregon, as well as other institutions of higher education throughout the United States, is that there's this inability to understand that there needs to be a cultural shift in order for people to want to be there. And so, yeah, that's great if you talk to SAFER, but SAFER's not really that diverse of an organization. And if that's your only go-to, nothing against them, but truth of the matter is they aren't that racially diverse, and bringing them up, that's great. But what I'm saying is, like, what type of self-assessment has been done by the city to see if it's even a place that different types of people would want to work? Because the city is extremely homogeneous. The city staff is the same, as well as the boards and commissions. And so there's a reason for that. And I just think we need to be cognizant of culture and how that affects the ability for people to want to work for an organization or not.
Yeah, I would agree. And SAFER isn't our only resource. I don't remember the full list, but we have about 30 agencies in the community that we reach out to with every posting, announcing our job posting and trying to work with them and promoting City of Springfield as a destination of choice for individuals to work. We've seen a pretty steady number of around 20% of the individuals that apply for our positions have identified themselves as an individual of color. That's been fairly consistent over the last 5 years that I've been here. We've gotten new technology that's allowed us to track the data better, and we've been working on kind of the tracking of where we may have adverse impacts through our selection process. And so what I would say, one is that we've seen an increase in diversity in our workplace. And some of the cultural activities that I think have been really helpful in changing the perception of the city as a destination of choice has really been some of the community work that our diversity committee has done with bringing individuals into City Hall and recognizing that City Hall is a safe place for all individuals and is a welcoming, safe place for individuals. The arts activity that goes on in the library and the events that the library hosts are other ways that we bring more diverse populations into our doors. And the more those individuals come into our doors, the more they start thinking about working with us or being us being the employer as somebody that they would want to work for. So there's a number of other activities that the committee has done over the years to promote cultural awareness within the city ranks, as well as being engaged with the community outside of the City Hall doors. So it's an ongoing work, but I think the challenge that we're seeing, at least on the HR side from recruitment, is really just been trying to find anybody with the unique skill sets that we need for some of the hard to fill government positions. Traffic is an area that's been a real struggle to find individuals that are interested in that. The engineering program as a whole, to become a civil engineer is a complicated process. And so that's a challenge. And so those have been areas, but even our positions that have historically had high application interest, our seasonal positions recently, where we typically can fill 12 individuals. I think we have 3 in our first posting and we had to go back out. So even entry-level positions is a challenge. And from some of the counterparts that I've worked with, we're not alone. And that in part has to do with just the fact that our pay ranges isn't as competitive with some of the other jobs that are out competing for that same population of talent.
And Chair Shaper, you have your hand up.
I do. I wanted to ask a question on this as well. I'm wondering, you mentioned the internal diversity committee, and I think Councillor Pitts raises a really, really good point. And I'm wondering if the internal diversity committee is involved in any of this hiring process to maybe have different opinions and viewpoints present in that job writing space, the interview space, all of those various important parts of the hiring process.
Yeah, so we've worked, and I personally have worked directly with representatives of that committee who had a sub-team that was focused on the recruitment and hiring side to collect their feedback and suggestions. And we've, in doing so, we've made some significant changes in at least the job posting. So we've been trying to focus one on just the landing page. So even just getting a link on the front part of it that talks about careers, which didn't exist before. You had to hit a couple of links to get there. Was one of the changes. And then we've added some language that was recommended from a member of that diversity committee to kind of show more inclusiveness and welcomingness into the posting. So now our front page has different images and different content identifying that diversity is kind of a core target of us as an organization. We already have a number of steps in our hiring process. So we have a blind application process. Those minimum qualifications are screened by a member of the HR department so that the management group can't selectively decide individuals that they know that they want to bring in through the interview process. And then we go through a pretty comprehensive interview question build. And then those, of course, are scored through HR. And then we have a regulatory requirement regarding veteran preference points that have to be applied at each stage of the process. And so, yes, we've worked with the committee and we continue to work with the committee on ideas and suggestions on wording. And we've also continued to look at just the selection process, and we've seen dividends in that. In one particular area, which was our operational unit, we actually applied a preference point for individuals that are historically underrepresented into that apprenticeship program. And the result of that was that we saw an increase in diversity in that group pretty significantly. And we also saw an increase on the talent that was entering into that apprenticeship program. Just to name a couple of the items that we've tackled.
Mayor Van Gordon.
No, I think this is a really interesting conversation. And I just would note that, you know, every big, small, medium corporation in America is going through the same exact thing right now. And I know we're trying to work our way through it, but I think it's important to recognize that this isn't necessarily a city issue. This is a changing dynamic in the labor field, and how do we sort of situate the city to be as competitive as possible to get the talent that we need. It was just an observation. There's no.
Thanks, Fair. Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of the things that I think we need to tackle over the summer season is to really do a SWOT analysis and try to figure out what our strengths are and where our vulnerabilities are, and really try to sell the strengths and then explore opportunities for addressing some of our vulnerabilities. We have a lot of things outside of just pure economics that would be a great reason to come work for the city of Springfield beyond just the culture, but the free clinic. And so there's a host of events that I don't think we promote as well. But I think our real challenge is looking creatively at what I would define as an underfill opportunity. And so finding somebody who doesn't have the traditional kinds of experience that you would want, and figure out how do you invest in training and education to move them up into those areas. I think that's going to be a core target that a lot of organizations are going to have to recognize, which is the traditional background and experience just may not be there because the market is so thin.
All right, if we're done with that topic, thank you, Shane. All right. This is the total budgeted expenditures for the general fund, and this is broken out into categories. For these categories, I intentionally lumped public safety together. So for the general fund, this is going to include police, fire, emergency management, the city prosecutor, and the mini court. The total cost of providing those services is $31.5 million, roughly 74% of our expenditures in the general fund. And then additionally, if we look over at the administrative services, these are support services, CMO, HR, IT, finance, and legal. Typically, these would be included as part of the cost of providing a service. So in accomplishing that, I look at all of our FTE across the entire organization. This public safety portion represents roughly 40% of that. So if I take 40% of that $6 million of administrative services, that's another roughly $2.5 million, bringing the full cost of public safety in the general fund to roughly $34 million. So I want you to hold on to that number. And this represents the same total amount of expenditures, 42 million, but this is the revenue stream that supports those expenditures. If you look at the largest share of this, this is our property taxes. coming in at roughly $24 million. So that's our public safety in the general fund comes in at 34 million. Our property taxes only cover 24 million of that, roughly 2/3. And I think this is something that is just, it's not fully understood by the citizens. How we make up the difference is other revenues, and some of those revenues maybe would be better aligned with other services at the city. Because of the pressures in the general fund, over time, we've slowly allowed some of those other revenue streams to subsidize public safety. Looking at some of those other categories, and just look at my sheet here. Starting with the intergovernmental, that's made up of our state shared revenues, which are primarily liquor, cigarette, and marijuana revenues. And then that also includes our pilot revenues, payment in lieu of taxes from both sub and eWeb. Councilor Pictionary.
Thanks, sorry to interrupt, but Nate, this graph, I'm totally confused. It shows, for example, if you look at the slice of the pie for intergovernmental revenues, it's $6 million, and you look to the right, it says other financing sources is 3,000,007, and you look at the slices, and it looks like there should be the opposite. But then even you go all the way around that whole pie chart, and there's only one or two that look like
right.
it.
So what we have here is potentially an issue with some automated scripts that produce a lot of these charts. And we've caught some of these and got them corrected. This one we have not. I don't know if Neil has access to the underlying data, Neil Obringer. Are the amounts correct, or are the pie pieces correct?
Nathan, I'm sorry, it would probably take me a few minutes to dive in. I can do that here on the side as you continue, if you'd like.
Okay, if you don't mind, then we're gonna revisit that. Looking at the amounts, well, let's wait. I mean, the amounts are looking correct. My feeling right now is there might be a mix up just in the pie pieces themselves. So let's come back to that. So going on to the transit room tax fund. And so I'm going to have charts for a number of funds moving forward. These are what I call our bellwether funds. These are the funds that are critical to the fiscal health of this organization. Looking at this one, there's a lot going on here. Looking at our revenue from 19 to 20, that was the impacts of COVID, and it was pretty immediate in this fund. Travel pretty much stopped and bottoming out in fiscal year 21. But a bright spot is the recovery in fiscal year 22. We're coming back close to pre-pandemic levels, and we forecast 23 to be at pre-pandemic levels. Essentially, there's a lot of pent-up demand in the hospitality and travel industry. So this is great. You can notice that the reserves sort of track those revenues, and we're anticipating to build those back up. We try to keep our ongoing operating expenditures in this fund low and use this money for special projects and one-time initiatives. Looking at the expenditures, they're relatively consistent. In 20 though and 21, it kind of peaks up. That was the purchase of the Flame property, and in both 2021 it was supporting the Olympic trials. And then it doesn't really drop down that much going into 22 and 23. We have some money programmed in for urban art installations. This fund is critical to the general fund as we transfer 5/9 of the revenues from this fund to the general fund in support of public safety. Our building safety fund. This is the fund that I refer to as the Feast and Famine Fund. Development is cyclical. As you can see, we're building some very healthy reserves in this fund, which will get us through that next downturn and make sure that we're able to support that minimum staffing we need for inspections within this community. You can go back to 14, and you can see how low those reserves can be drawn down in a recession. Just looking at some of that activity here, you see that peak in 20. Nancy in her message mentioned development's been strong in this community. We're starting to see a lot more residential development. Typically doesn't generate as much revenue as some of these large commercial projects can. I think back in fiscal year 20, that peak came from some large commercial projects. And then you can see in 20 and 21 a little bit of dip in the expenditures. I think that was the result of some vacancies that look like they are now filled. Moving on to the street operating fund. So in this fund, this has been one of our challenging funds. Going back to fiscal year 14, 15, 16, that was in a period where we really, because of the recession, had reduced staffing to what I would call a bare bone level, and essentially had stopped preservation activities, which is problematic because it's better to maintain and maximize the life of an asset and delay the expensive capital replacement of it. With the passage of HB 2017, that at the state level increased gas taxes and vehicle registration fees that are coming down to the local level. We staffed up 7 FT across all the utility funds to build up a team to start addressing backlog of preservation activities. One of the most effective preservation activities is crack sealing and slurry sealing program. And we started that back, I believe, in fiscal year 21 again, and we've seen some great results. We anticipated the expenditures in this fund to again exceed the revenues. We built up some reserves, and with that staffing, we knew that we'd start drawing down on those reserves again. So that is planned. That's something that if we can't find another funding source, we're going to have to manage that staffing level through attrition, hopefully by not losing those preservation activities. The local sewer, I'm going to cover the drainage just conceptually at the same time. These are healthy funds. And the reason is they're user fee based, and we can set our user fees for full cost recovery of both our ongoing operations as well as our capital programs. There's a lot going on here. We did something different this year. It's a little busier. I hope it makes sense. But we broke out the capital program out of the expenditures, and we broke out the debt service. So the solid red line is essentially then our ongoing operational cost. The dashed red line, and you see that spike in FY17 is debt service, both revenue and expenditure. That was a bond refunding. And then the dotted red line is our capital program. You see a jump in 22 and 23. That's because when we budget the full cost of our capital projects, even though they may span over multiple years. So the actual amount that we spend is less. And if you look at that kind of trajectory of that dotted red line prior to that, it gives you a better idea of what we're spending annually on the capital program. The ambulance fund. This is another challenging fund, important fund as it impacts the general fund. And you saw in the 5-year forecast, we have some subsidies to the ambulance fund. 300,000 in fiscal year 23, I think roughly 500,000 in fiscal year 24. I'm going to get back to the subsidies here in a second. This used to be a really healthy fund, a strong fund. And then we saw a decrease in our Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements from the federal government. To the degree that I'm going off of some old numbers, but I think they illustrate the point. I think the cost of a transport is somewhere in the neighborhood of the full cost, $1,800. I believe that our reimbursements from the federal government on a transport are somewhere between $400 and $500. So we've had to find other ways to fund this fund. We've done through the Fire Med program. We did it through expanding our billing services for other agencies. But over time, we've had competition come in on the billing, and as a result, lost customers to profitable customers. And so we've seen those programs shrink as well. So we've had multiple years where the expenditures have exceeded the revenues, and this seems to be the trajectory for this fund. Fiscal year 21 looks strange. You see a significant decrease in revenues followed by a significant increase in 22. We changed billing software and we got behind in our billings and collections. And so those revenues would eventually be collected. So we have revenues in 22 that should have been collected in 21. And that's, we essentially made it up, but it created some funniness there. And it caused us to actually go into negative territory and had to have a subsidy come over from the general fund to plug that. Councilor Pictionary.
Hi, thank you, Nate. I see the trajectory of the operating expenditures and over the past 9 years, or actually 7 years, 7 or 8 years, that it's gone up $1.5 million. And percentage-wise, that looks like about a 20% increase over the years. And what's the driver behind the rise in cost of the operating expenditures? Is it the cost of labor?
It's pretty much the cost of labor, yes.
Okay, so it's really kind of nothing else driving that, but basically the labor.
You know, I'm sure that we've also seen inflation in materials and services, but if you look at the primary expenditure in this fund, it is labor. Let's see, anything else I want to cover on this? Yes, I mentioned the subsidy. So our ambulance fund is part of our first response, minimum staffing for first response. If we were to get out of the business of doing transports, this expenditure wouldn't go away. A portion of the expenditure of this fund would then come over to the general fund as part of our minimum staffing. So it makes sense for us to have some level of subsidy. And that's a project we're still working on, is to figure out exactly what that value is. So we know what the sweet spot is, that as long as our subsidy is below that number, it makes sense. If we ever exceed that number, it's time to really evaluate whether this is a business that we want to continue to be in. Our Booth Kelly Fund, Mayor Van Gordon.
Nate, can you go back for a second? And I just want to make sure that point is really clear, right? So the issue with the ambulance fund is mainly driven by federal reimbursements. Is that correct? Right? Like, it's not driven by the fact that we basically use those FTEs for broader emergency response.
Well, I would say it's a complicated question. I mean, it's driven by a lot of factors. It's driven by the escalation in public safety, and specifically in fire and life safety. You could say it's partly driven by wages from our merger. It is driven by reimbursements. We are starting to see GMT reimbursements. These are federal funds passed down through the state. GEMT stands for Ground Emergency Medical Transport, and it's to make up for the underfunding on the Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements, but it's not enough. So there's a whole host of challenges that are leading to this, including that minimum staffing.
Okay, great.
Does that answer that question, Director?
Yeah, thank you.
Our Booth Kelly, which is our leased property fund. And there's a number of properties that the city owns that are basically run commercially that we've acquired for a number of different reasons. With the Booth Kelly site, it was donated to the city. We acquire sites for future development, but if there's structures on them, we'll lease them out and make a revenue. This is a fund that has been historically very strong, and we have used it to subsidize over the years our general fund. However, at the expense of not reinvesting back into the site and a growing body of deferred maintenance on the assets on a number of these sites. You can see that if you look at that drop in fiscal year 19 to 20, we lost an anchor tenant, Greenbrier Rail. They were using a space at this site that was uniquely suited to the business they were in, rehabbing rail cars, and we have not been able to get the rents from that site since. We're starting to lease it out for different purposes to other businesses, but not at the level that Greenbrier was providing in rents. Additionally, you can see in 21 and 22, just a little bit of the impacts of COVID on local businesses and on rents as well. That spike in 22 in expenditures is related to the demolition of the Carter building, and that's probably also partially related to the drop we're seeing from 22 to 23 in the rents. As a result, we're drawing down on the reserves in this fund. We continue to work on maximizing, and we have a position in CMO that I'll speak to later that we'll be partially working on just maximizing how we manage this fund and the rents that we bring in. Luke Lundberg.
I just want to verify, I think I've asked about this in the past, but you said the loss of the anchor tenant was the major drop in the revenue, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I believe at the time it was indicated that because their location was so specialized that you were having challenges finding replacement tenant.
Correct.
Okay. Is that something that needs to be basically more capital output to renovate the facilities or do big changes to it on a much broader scale than say just electrical work or HVAC or anything of the sort for you to be able to get back to getting the types of tenants that would bring in that level of revenue?
So again, it's a complicated question. There's definitely some rehab that we can do that'll increase the rents in this site, and some work that we can do to even make other spaceables that are right now not leasable that could be leasable. That specific site though that we're talking about the Sawtooth building. You would have to literally stand inside of it to truly experience and understand that building. It is not a site suitable to most businesses. But to a company that needs a large space with a rail spur and space for cranes to move large rail cars around, it was perfect. It's not good for really a lot else right now. It's being used by one of the local businesses for storage of materials, lumber. So it's got challenges, and I don't know, it would take a lot of money in that specific building, I think, to make it something else.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was getting with the question is I don't want to get too much into the policy of what does this council want to do with it and what does the city want to do with that kind of thing, but just to get a scope or get an idea that this is probably not a location that we're going to be able to recuperate that money back to those levels at any time in the foreseeable future unless we get a very specific tenant that has those very specific needs. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, and Neil Ladati came up for a moment. I don't know if he has something to add.
Nathan, yeah, Neil Ladati, Assistant City Manager here at the city. Luke, you're 100% correct. We need to look at that space in a different way. In the meantime, though, we are actually partnering with the contractors that do have a home base in Booth Kelly to use that space. So we will start seeing some revenues. We've actually gone through all of the leases that are in Booth Kelly to update them to make sure that they're getting the rates that we should be getting in that business. So you are correct, Luke. We need to make some changes before a large business like we had in there before would be profitable. But in the meantime, we're really trying to partner with those that are in Booth Kelly to bring in revenues.
Okay. Yeah, you guys just clarified my understanding very well. I guess just my general point is I think that this is probably an area that I would say is, because there's so much potential for the facility, is that capital outlays in that location is something that should be preserved so that way we can get back to revenue positive in the future. So just my general point. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Neil, as well. I'm going to back up to that pie chart. So I have verified the dollar amounts are correct. The pie slices they are associated with are not correct. So if that helps you, Council Pictionary. And then I'm going to just speak a little bit more just so you have a better understanding of what some of those revenues are within those categories. I think I already covered the intergovernmental, so ignore the slice of the pie. That's roughly $6 million or 15%, and that was the state shared revenues and the in lieu of taxes from the two utilities. Another large source there is the other financing sources, 4 million or roughly 9%. That's made up of the transfer from the transient room tax fund, as well as indirect charges charged to our utility funds. Looking at the charges for services, $4 million, roughly 10%. That's made up of our fire service contracts that we have with other taxing districts, as well as a right-of-way fee that we charge to our local utilities, both our sewer and drainage utilities. And I think other than that, I could point out the license, permits, and fees, roughly $3 million or 7%. That's made up of our franchise fees, our planning fees, and our business license fees. So we're using a pretty diverse range of revenues really to shore up the general fund outside of our property taxes. And I think going back to that is, this essentially is it's really pushed us towards a fee for services structure. And if that's really seen and felt at our counters where those fees are paid. And I think of our development counter as one. And I know that the council hears a lot from the public in regards to a lot of those fees. And it's challenging because there's this misconception out there that as folks are paying these fees, the thought is always, well, hey, isn't this what I pay my taxes for? And my response is no. The taxes, the property taxes that we pay don't even come close to covering the cost of public safety, let alone anything else. And that's really the explanation on why we've been moving in that direction of cost recovery and more fees for services where it makes sense. Any other questions on this pie chart before I go back to where I left off? Stormwater, I covered this when I talked about the sewer, the spike again in 21 of the dashed line in the revenue was a bond refunding or debt refunding. And I think here too, you also see some more significant capital program activity happening back there in 16, 17. Our medical dental reserve. And I share this one because it's a large program and it's one of our bright spots, actually. So we have self-insured medical and dental, and in addition to that, we have a wellness clinic, which is a very popular program with our employees. And this kind of speaks to the culture that was alluded to as what makes a place desirable to work at. But we have, through our, and I think largely attributed to the wellness clinic, really kept the cost down on our self-insured plan. In fact, we've kept it down below that of our peers in both self-insured programs as well as traditionally insured programs. And just speaking to what's going on here, the dotted blue line is what is considered a healthy reserve level for these activities. And we actually hired an actuary to determine that. Early on in this program, we didn't have that understanding. With that understanding now, our reserve is well above of that healthy reserve level. And so we've been working on trying to bring it down to that level. What we're trying to avoid doing, though, is decreasing contributions to where in the future, when we get back to that level of just normal increases, all of a sudden people get hit with these higher increases. So we've been holding our rates flat. In addition to holding them flat, we've been doing benefit holidays, and essentially a benefit holidays for a given month. We won't charge the employees for their proportionate share of healthcare costs. And then for the city departments that pay the city portion out of their budgets, we still transfer that over the insurance fund, but instead of going into our health insurance program, it goes into a separate reserve account, which we have designated our PERS rainy day fund. At this point, that rainy day fund stands at $3.8 million. And we're looking at doing another benefit holiday this coming June, which will increase that by about another 600,000. So that's a nice reserve that we're building to help offset some of those future PERS costs that we saw on that earlier chart that I showed you. Another thing is, in addition to holding the rates flat, we expected that reserve balance to start coming down, but if you look at the expenditures, and those bar graphs include this expenditures broken out by claims, admin, and wellness clinic. But if we just look at the total expenditure of each bar, you see that drop in 21 and 22. That we think is related to the pandemic and folks not wanting to go to the hospital or to the doctor's office and putting off those optional type procedures. We think that there's probably a pent-up demand there, and we'll probably see that come back into our plan in a future year, and we're anticipating that in 23. But we are actively working to getting that reserve down to what we consider to be a healthy level. And then as far as that larger budget in 23, recognize that with these health insurance plans, you can have a good year and you can have a bad year, and the difference between the two can be significant. We have to always budget as if it might be that bad year. And so that's always why you tend to see the most recent proposed budget is much greater than all the previous actual experiences, typically. All right, so this is the FY23 budget, all funds. So just going to the first chart, FY23 proposed bottom line, that's a $384 million budget. That is a eye-popping number. And the thing is, though, and I like to break this down, if we look at that $384 million budget, go up above it is our operating portion of that budget. Personal services, materials and services, capital outlay. All funds, that's $126 million. Dropping down into then the capital, that's almost 52 million. Again, we budget our capital program for the full cost of the projects, even though they span multiple years. So not all of that will be spent. And you can see that by going back to the actuals for 2021. And then, of course, non-departmental, the majority of that is reserves, which we budget as an expenditure, but is locked up from spending. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. For the personal services, we're just shy of 64 million, dropping down to that table below. Of that, almost 38 million is in salaries. The next largest two expenditures related to personal services is our medical, dental, and our retirement plan, both at roughly just shy of $9 million or 14%. You hear a lot about PERS as the reason for the problems that we're experiencing with our budget. While PERS is one of many contributors, it's only 14% of our cost of our personal services. It is not our largest contributor. If I was to point out our largest contributor to the sort of funding situation we're in, it goes back to the 90s and Measure 5 and 50. George Jesse.
I think this chart clarifies for me, because I had on the printed document, it showed the PERS retirement plan as being only 1%, and the city retirement plan, I'm not sure what that is being 14%. The numbers must be transposed.
So we've replaced a few slides in this presentation. Again, a lot of this material we've just set up to populate automatically, and sometimes there's some things that get through unintentionally. That was caught and corrected in this presentation. The document, if you downloaded it already, would be incorrect, but I believe we've updated the website if you want to get the updated page. So disregard this page in your document, George, and use the numbers that you see up on the screen.
Okay. And just for clarification, did you identify what is there a new city retirement plan beyond PERS or OPS-RP?
There is the city retirement plan is actually a legacy plan that predates PERS. We didn't come onto the PERS plan until 2003, I believe. Prior to that, we had a city retirement plan. When we went to PERS, we had a number of public safety individuals that opted to stay with the city retirement plan. That is a closed plan. At this point, I believe it only consists of police officers, and no one new is coming onto it. And it's a plan that will eventually phase itself out, and then we will be entirely PERS and OPSER. So we have two plans in place: PERS for the majority of employees, and then the city retirement plan for just a limited number of police officers.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so this is taking some of those numbers and putting them into pie charts to just give some context to it. This is the total requirements, just broken out by those categories. Not a lot that I'm going to say here, I think, other than another thing I should mention about that 384 million is it includes another entity, which is MWMC, Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission. As part of an IGA between the cities of Eugene and Springfield, we have a regional wastewater facility. The city of Springfield handles the administration and the capital program, and the city of Eugene handles the plant operations. However, as part of our administration function, we adopt their entire budget. So the entirety, both the Eugene and the Springfield portion, flow through our budget. So of that $384 million budget that you see there, 149 million of it relates to MWMC. And I'm going to break that out in some other slides as well, because I think it's such a large organization just in terms of its dollar value that it sometimes can really skew how things look on the city side. So taking each of these categories, starting with the non-departmental, this breaks it out further with another view. You can see of that 207 million, 177 of it is reserves. And actually the unappropriated balance and the contingency also in a way act as reserves. And the interfund transfers, those are typically just the movement of funds between funds, a lot of times for future expenditures. They're not actual expenditures. If they're tied to an actual expenditure, that would have shown up in the capital or operating budget. So from this 207 million, it's just a debt service of roughly 10 million that's actually leaving the agency as an expenditure. Of that 207 million, 92 million of it is related to MWMC. This is looking at the operating costs by department. From looking at this slide, it looks like Development and Public Works is by far our largest department, over, I guess, larger than Police and Fire and Life Safety combined. However, again, it's misleading with MWMC as part of the Development and Public Works budget. Of that $54 million, 26 million of it relates to MWMC. So that leaves the Development and Public Works budget of roughly 28 million. It is still a significant budget and large department. It supports 4 major programs here at the city: our development counter, our sewer system, a drainage system, and our street system. And this is our capital budget. And this one actually breaks out MWMC's piece as its own slice. Total capital budget of just shy of 52 million. The regional wastewater portion is 31 million, the largest share of that pie. So this gets us to our FY23 highlights. And this is where I mentioned that I'm going to be talking about some of the positions that we're adding. On here, we have, these are ongoing changes. It has the department, the position, and the amount and the funding source. Starting with a deputy police chief. Our command staff, leadership staff in the police department is lean compared to a lot of our peers. And this is us addressing that issue with the much needed leadership position. Looking at the ARPA project manager, this is a limited, and that deputy chief is an ongoing position. It's funded with ARPA funds through December 30th, 2024, but this is one of the positions that we'll need to address moving past that point. The next one is a ARPA project manager. We're bringing on this position to help with the delivery of our ARPA projects. Those ARPA funds, we received 14 million in a direct allocation, as well as many more million coming down through the state. And so we have a lot on our plates in terms of delivery. That level of funding has been spread across every city and county and state across the nation. There are a lot of funds out there right now competing for limited resources. It's partially, I think, in my opinion, one of the drivers of inflation that's going on, and we have this deadline that we have to meet. And in the hope is that that deadline will be extended, but we have to act as if it won't be. To make sure that we expend all those dollars and don't leave anything on the table, we're bringing a limited duration position to help us with that delivery. When those funds are gone, this position goes away as well. The next two positions, and I think we've got to look at those two in combination with the last one, which is we're converting an existing position, which is a deputy fire marshal to a fire marshal. That's a leadership position, deputy chief position in fire. We don't have a deputy chief position right now, so this is something that's part of our IGA and us having to fulfill that requirement. And then additionally, we're adding a fire training position and a fire inspector position. That fire inspector position is within the fire marshal's office to backfill the change from that deputy fire marshal up to a fire marshal. Again, this is us fulfilling the requirements of our IGA. Due to funding issues, these are positions that we've held off on filling, but we're at a point where we recognize they need to be filled. They're needed positions. The two full-time, full cost positions are being funded with ARPA. The conversion of the fire marshal one is being done directly through the general fund. Both those fire positions, the training and the inspector position, are ongoing. We'll have to find a way to work those into or keep them in our budget once the ARPA funds are gone. In CMO, we are adding a legislative and public affairs analyst. This is funded through a number of sources, through CEDA, Springfield Economic Development Agency, ARPA funds, and the Booth Kelly Fund. This is something that'll touch on our solutions when we talk about, how we address our funding issues. Part of addressing it is legislative. We need to go to the state and work with them, to find ways to share some of those resources, being a high income tax state. It's also, there's a lot on the plate in CMO right now with the unfunded mandates, the ARPA funds, and this is just a recognition that we needed some staffing in that department to deliver on a lot of the things that are being required of us. Luke Lumberg.
Just to be clear, you said that the new positions that are added on ARPA now have to then be transferred over, correct?
That is the plan. That'll happen.
Okay.
In future budget,
And that's 2 years from now, right?
Yes.
Okay. So we'll have 2 years of ARPA funding, and then this additional, however much that is, don't feel like 300,000-ish, is then in the general fund, correct?
That's correct. So
Or
2.5 years from now. And
okay.
It's going to be, if we look at the total here, I mean, we're looking a lot more. We're looking at the deputy chief 234, the ARPA project, limited duration. The next two, roughly 140 and 130. I mean, there we're already at about over 500. Drop down to the programmer analyst. That one we think through attrition or some vendor contracts that we can discontinue, we might be able to offset that one. The senior planner, the permanent, we'll have to find funding. So we're looking for larger I think the HR specialist is ongoing. We're looking more around 700,000 to 800,000. We're going to need to fold into the general fund in 2.5 years.
Okay,
Yeah, that's my thoughts as well.
all right, thank you.
Moving on, a programmer analyst in IT. This was a position that we previously had, it was picked up as part of one of our reductions and replaced with a vendor contract. However, we have a backlog of applications work here at the city where we think we can get some efficiencies through automations. And so this is where we want to staff up and in the hopes that at a future time, through potentially attrition or through discontinuing some vendor contracts, we can bring the budget for applications team back roughly to the level that it's at currently now. So this is a strategic investment that we don't see as an ongoing indefinitely cost to the general fund. The limited duration senior planner to permanent. This was a position that was brought on when another individual was moved on to the development code project. The development code project was meant to be finite. However, due to a lot of just unfunded mandates coming down from the state, what was meant to be finite is starting to feel infinite. And so this was just a recognition for an individual in a temporary position that we came to the conclusion it's not temporary and it's not fair to have this individual hanging out and feeling like their work position could go away every year. So we're converting that to a permanent position. HR specialist. I talked about a small team. I think it's roughly was 6 FTE. We talked about the turnover as well as, again, mandates that are coming down from the state. One of them administering the paid family medical leave program, and there's others as well. We were at a point where our staffing was just too lean in our HR department, and there's a lot of risks associated with a lot of these programs. We needed to staff up. And so that was the justification for adding that position. That is planned on being an ongoing position. The custodian position, this is actually being funded through utility funds. It's a custodian position for our operations facility on 18th. This is something we've had in the past. It's been picked up in reduction, but the work is still there. There's deferred maintenance in the building that if we don't address it could lead to greater costs in the future. And it was pulling staffing away from other important work out in the community. And so the feeling was this would be a prudent add to this budget. The utility funds spread across the three, it's had a small impact. And I think you discussed rates this evening. You recognize that in the rates that you've been adopting over the past few years. I already covered the conversion of the deputy fire marshal to a fire marshal. Moving on to our one-time changes. I'm not going to go through each of these. The amounts are smaller, they're one-time in nature, so we don't have that ongoing expense. I'll just leave this up for a second just to give you an opportunity to see these if you have questions later. But I do want to use this as an opportunity to just mention one of the things that isn't in here that I really wanted to be in here for add is a contribution to our reserve for deferred building maintenance. We have a large and growing backlog of deferred maintenance for not just our city infrastructure in terms of streets and sewer assets, but our city buildings, City Hall, our Justice Center, our 18th Street facility, as well as our 5 fire stations. And in, I believe, 20 and 21, we made contributions of $400,000 into Fund 420 to start saving for that backlog. And then due to just budget constraints, that's something we cut. And so that can't continue. That's a problem. And it's one of the challenges that we need to address moving forward. Future year considerations. A number of these are familiar to you. I won't touch on all of them. Let's see, the ones I will, I mentioned the backlog of deferred maintenance on infrastructure. Response to the climate friendly and equitable communities legislation. This is that unfunded mandate, and it's one of the larger ones and we don't even fully, I think, understand the full impact that's going to have on this organization. We staffed up in our Development Public Works Community Development Department 3 positions, which I believe we're in the process of trying to fill. There's some of the positions that were challenged to fill. but it is to address these mandates that are coming down from the Capitol. Councilor Stair.
You are getting down to the 42nd Street levy in a minute, right?
In a minute, yes.
Yeah, I'll have a question then.
Excellent. I was actually going to skip over it, but I'm not anymore. Moving on to the fire and life safety governance model with the functionally merged departments between Eugene and Springfield. There's no question that we have experienced savings. What we did was we slowed down the growth of our fire and life safety services, the growth in expenditures. However, we've, for the most part, I think, kind of picked that low hanging fruit and experienced most of those savings, and we're back into that place where the growth and the cost of these services is outpacing the growth of revenues that support them. This conversation is happening. We have this governance conversation that's going on right now. The outcome of that's going to be important to the city and the potential impact of continuing to provide the level of service in our fire and life safety department that our community has come to depend on. So that is just one of those things that is out there and could have a significant impact on us financially. 42nd Street levy is a recognition that levy is holding back and holding back waters and protecting a significant amount of assets, I believe in the billions of dollars. And I think there's kind of a recognition that in terms of the construction of that levy, there's some uncertainty to how it's been constructed and that it needs to be analyzed, and there could be the potential replacement of that levy. I am not the one to speak to that one personally, but it's one that I hear discussed a lot, and I put it on here, and that's why I was going to gloss over it. Councilor Stair.
Yeah, I was about to say I might just hold that question for Public Works whenever they speak, because I did want to talk about the composition of the current levy and whether we're going to be able to build on top of it or whether we're going to have to just tear it down and start over.
Okay, Mayor Van Gordon.
You're probably going to have more detailed questions than that, and maybe we could punt that to Neil and he can set something up with you to go through all the material. Because once you start, you will have more questions.
Okay, and Neil's coming up.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sean.
Yes, Councilor Stair, we can definitely give you that background.
All right, and then ARPA project implementation. I've talked a lot about this already. We've got a lot of money to spend in a very short time frame and a lot of competition in terms of the labor and materials to deliver on that. So that's going to be one of our challenges over the coming 2.5 years. Solutions. So a lot of these are familiar again. The first two are where we like to go, grow the economic base and encourage smart growth. However, they're hard to influence and they take time. And so where we always go in the short term is the next three, which is diversifying our revenue base, exploring new revenue options, service level changes, and process improvement initiatives. To that last one, process improvement initiatives, it's something we're always doing, but again, this is an area where I feel like we've picked a lot of the low-hanging fruit, and it's getting more and more challenging to squeeze efficiencies in this area. And that brings us back to those two, diversifying the revenue base and the service level changes. Those are items that we will be bringing to you ideas in a work session, council to council in a work session in the future. In terms of addressing our structural imbalance in the general fund. But I want to go to the very last one, which is the legislative policy changes. That partly speaks to that position that's being added in CMO. I'm going to say it again, funding for local government is broken in this state. And it's not something that we can fix here locally. We need to partner with our legislators up at the Capitol and finding solutions in whatever form those solutions will take. And so that's an area where we need to invest more energy and be truly more strategic. And that completes my presentation this evening. I hope it didn't run too long. I hope it's useful information. Do you have any questions for me?
This is Darlene. I have a question about the government money, the ARPA money.
Yes.
Do they have to approve that, or do you send them a list of your projects? Or did they just give us a bunch of money and say, use it?
So we do have reporting requirements. There's a number of ways you can use this. One of them is you can use it for revenue recovery, and that's what we've done. And they have a specific formula for how you can apply that towards revenue recovery, revenue replacement. Once you've qualified it through revenue replacement, it's a pretty broad category in terms of how you can use it. In fact, the best way to describe how you can use it is not what you can use it for, but by what you can't use it for. And what you can't use it for is debt service and reserve, putting in reserves. That's it. So any other expenditure is pretty much qualifies if you've qualified the amount through revenue replacement. Based on their formula, over the period of time that we can apply this revenue replacement, we can qualify the entire 14 million under that. We pretty much have very broad discretion in how we use that money, but we are required still to report on how we use it. Stephen Schmuck.
Yes, so first of all, I can tell a lot of hard work and probably agonizing went into this budget. I think it's be commended for the presentation in terms of how I'm seeing it. Obviously, you guys dig into it a lot more than I do, but it's helpful. I do want to ask of the legislative mandates, unfunded or otherwise, which ones have you pushed back and said we're not going to do?
Neil's coming up to answer that.
Yeah, Committee Member Schmuck, that's a great question. So just looking at 2021, 18 of the bills that passed are mandates. So they've added, so it's building code, housing, transportation, finance, public meetings. Even doing these meetings virtual was one of the mandates that we have purchased technology to do. So we have staff diving into climate friendly mandates, transportation, housing. The mayor and the legislative committee are very engaged. And so we're really looking into any mandate that comes down. We're not, if we have to do it, we have to do it, but we're engaging on everything that we possibly can. And some of our staff members, especially in housing, and some of the work that's happening in the climate friendly mandates that are coming down, they're really leaders in the state coming from Springfield, Oregon, to try to get even our perspective out there. So some work is going into that.
I'm a little confused on that last statement. Help me understand what you mean by local representatives. They're driving these mandates, and so you feel obligated to support them.
No, I'm sorry if I was not clear. Some of the legislation to provide Springfield's perspective, like for housing, some of our staff members are kind of the leaders in providing our message forward for how these things should be moving forward. So not supporting the mandates as much as giving Springfield's perspective. So for example, the housing development code, our council has asked to rewrite our development code. Our staff is rewriting it. House Bill 2001 came down at the same time. So that impacts Springfield. So we have people that, we have staff members that are really focused on protecting Springfield's interests for all of these bills, specifically the ones that I outlined.
So of the 18, one I was mentioned an HR department. You felt there might be some risk there, as I understood the conversation. So they'll not maybe be a candidate to say, we're just not going to do that. Are there other areas? I mean, you just flat doing them all, not saying, we're not doing this. Is that an option? Have you considered that as an option?
Yeah, we would confer with legal on that, whether we wouldn't have.
But there have not been any pushback at all in terms of we're not financed to do this, therefore we're not going to take it on.
Yeah, that's a good question. We can push back, but eventually we might have to do a mandate, something that's mandated, correct?
So I'm just trying to understand here. So it doesn't appear to be any inkling that to push back. It's always we accept these mandates and don't throw a fit, if you will.
Well, I'm going to jump in because I throw a fit. So I could say that, our community development department will come to us and they'll look at it from their lens and say, okay, this is what's coming down from the state and this is what's expected. I, as a finance person, see the bill and I'm like, oh my God, we can't afford that. It's like, do we really have to do that? What if we don't do that? What will happen? So we push back internally. And so we're not just, lack of a better way of putting this, just laying down and saying, oh, whatever you say we have to do, we're going to do. But at the same time, we're consulting our legal and we're making sure that we aren't putting ourselves in a position where we're going to get ourselves in trouble at a later date. So,
yeah, for example, the stormwater mandates that came down, we were in the litigation to push back against that. So that was a years-long process.
Okay. Well, let me also point out, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Nathan, I want to also point out that, measure 5, measure 50, the reason we had a change in PERS was, because of those. And so, I understand it's impacting us now, but, there are some good things from those measures. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
They were well-intended measures, especially if you're someone on a fixed income and property values are just skyrocketing because folks are coming from, let's say, California, where they can sell a house and buy 2 up here. That was challenging, but there were some unintended consequences. And one of the things that we could do, and we need to work on this legislatively, is how about at the point of resale, the property value resets to real market value. So the individual in the fixed income had that protection. But once it resells, that protection shouldn't transfer to a new owner, especially if they can afford that higher tax rate. And I'm going to skip to Nancy because she spent some time in California and she's familiar with this.
Actually, I think I want to hit the pause, but I want to clarify a couple of things. I don't think it's really accurate to say that our city doesn't push back on unfunded mandates. I would say we strenuously push back, but we do it in our lane, so to speak. So we have our elected officials, they are here and they represent the city in their elected capacity. As an elected official, that's part of their role, is to be part of the legislative process, to set the legislative agenda, to establish those council priorities that form our legislative agenda. As staff, we give the data and analysis to help the council make those decisions. So Member Spunk, you're absolutely correct. It would be accurate to say, hey, we don't have the resources to do this mandate, but it really depends on what is being asked of us. There are times when, depending on the mandate, the state will say, well, if you're not going to do it, we'll do it for you, or something to that ilk. So, it really depends on the circumstance, but I really want to make sure that I address the idea that we don't simply just roll over and say, well, naturally we're going to do this. We always are advocating strenuously for the city. And then I'm going to let the mayor speak to this because this really is more in the auspices of our policymakers. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's why that it's kind of a confusing story, right? Because from a policymaking perspective, we are constantly talking about this to local officials. This is what we lobby about all the time. We just gave a tour to some of the state land use commissioners this last week, and specifically the costs associated with mandates and the capacity to complete that is specifically things that we sort of talked about, Steve. So the conversation about unfunded mandates comes up when we interact with our elected officials really pretty consistently, especially the legislators, especially anybody from Salem, and trying to get people to understand the ability and what they're actually asking from a city the size of Springfield. It's not, the last couple of weeks, it's not uncommon for me to be calling around to other jurisdictions looking for additional support from, and just asking other mayors, like, what are you seeing? You know, how are you guys addressing it, to try to get a handle on everything that's being asked of us from Salem right now. It's a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up.
Now, I'm going to turn it over to Chair Shaper at this point. My presentation is pretty much done, and I'll let you run the meeting from this point forward.
Thank you, Nathan. That was a really lovely, robust discussion. I know we still have a couple of questions. I did want to do a very quick time check, because I also know we want to do business from the audience and missed our scheduled intermission. So I wanted to make sure that folks are comfortable continuing forward with a couple of questions and then moving to business from the audience from there. All right. It looks like folks are okay with that. I'm seeing head nods. So Paul, you had a question?
More of a comment than a question. In light of the fact that you have this, one-time ARPA money coming in, and it sounds like there's already a list of ideas on how to spend that, but you're still developing the framework. I would really love to see, as you lay this all out, what are the categories that these things are going into in terms of things like, obviously there's addressing the shortfalls that have occurred as a result of the pandemic. But I remember a conversation we had, and maybe I'm making this up, but a few years ago in the budget committee, we were talking about how there was some self-service and some automation that was brought into the permitting process, and how much money that saved and how much more efficient it was and things like that. If you have projects like that are coming out of the ARPA dollars, I think those would be wonderful things to talk more about. Nathan, in your narrative over and over again, I was hearing kind of that connection between this is where the money's coming from and this is where it's going. And the more you can do that with the citizenry, especially with this ARPA money, I mean, it's not a huge sum of money by any means, but still it's a shot in the arm, and the city has an opportunity to do some great things with it. I would love to hear more of that promotion over time as those projects develop.
All right, and I can forward you, I don't know if you've seen them, but we've had a couple work sessions with CBMs that talk about this. One of the things I could share with you that we just, I believe, are at the point of having gone through interviews and we'll be awarding a contract, but we're replacing our legacy light system with LEDs. And it's about a $2.75 million project. You're going to see a significant improvement in the lighting in this community. You can already see this from work that was done here on Main Street and funded by ODOT. But that project is going to pay for itself, we estimate, in 10 to 11 years. After that, it is going to generate savings in perpetuity. So we're doing some great things with it, but I hear you on that.
Great.
Like Steve, you had a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I'm hearing comments about Measure 5 being the bad boy out there. I remember before Measure 5, everybody was voting new property taxes in, and it was going up astronomically around here. We don't have a sales tax in Oregon, so everybody was using those. And they went out and passed Measure 5 to try and stop that. And it saved my life, to tell you the truth. I don't know if I support it or not, but something had to be done. So there's been talk about a sales tax, but that's been turned down so many times. And of course, we have the high income tax, but there was a reason for Measure 5. I know everybody talks about it, but it did a lot of damage in its day. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think now, would it be all right with everybody if we move to business from the audience? I think we've had a really robust discussion. I know next it was additional questions and discussion on the budget, but would it be all right with folks if we move to business from the audience? No, or would you like to do more? Sorry. Business from the audience, okay? Thumbs up if that's okay. Joe, sorry, Councilor Pictionary.
It's okay. I just wanted to make sure if everybody was good with questions before we move on. I know I'm fine with it, Holly, but I just
Okay.
want to make sure everybody else was.
All right, thank you. If everybody's okay with moving to business from the audience, then I think let's do that. So, all right. This will allow members of the public the opportunity to ask questions and provide comment on the proposed budget. Please state your name and ward or general location and limit your comment to 3 minutes. The order of public comment will be as follows. First, anyone who is in person at City Hall, staff will bring the member of the public up on camera to provide comment. Second, anyone who has raised their hand in Zoom webinar. And then written comment can be submitted via email. And written comment can be submitted via normal mail as well, which would have been done a while ago. All right, is there anyone who would like to, are there any people who would like to give comment?
Chair.
Sorry about that. Chair Shaper, there are no members of the public here at City Hall. We've received no written or email public comment. So I will give folks who have joined the meeting here just a minute to raise their hand, and I'll let you know if we have anybody that's interested in speaking.
Great, thank you so much, Neil.
Chair, it doesn't look like we have anybody that wishes to speak.
All right, thank you. I believe that after this would be adjournment, if that sounds right. All right, so I would say, are we good to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
Do we need a second?
Second.
And then a voice vote?
Typically, I don't think we vote, we just
Aye.
adjourn the meeting. So you can just say, then I adjourn the meeting with no other items.
Okay, I adjourn the meeting with no other items. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.